The silence inside the gilded cage weighed heavier than the crystal chandeliers suspended above the dining room. A silence designed to swallow secrets whole and never give them back. It was the kind of quiet that made every clink of silverware sound like a gunshot, every whisper feel like a confession. Outside, the city pulsed with Friday night chaos. But here, behind velvet ropes and bulletproof glass disguised as Art Deco windows, the air hung thick with cigar smoke, aged whiskey, and the particular tension that followed powerful men into private rooms. The warmth from the kitchen barely reached the dining floor, as if even heat knew better than to disturb the carefully maintained atmosphere of wealth meeting violence in tailored suits. Florence Martin had been standing for 9 hours straight, the balls of her feet screaming protests her face would never echo. Her hands, hidden behind her back as she waited near the kitchen door, trembled with the specific exhaustion that came from carrying heavy trays while pretending your body didn't exist. The black vest and crisp white shirt of her uniform clung to her spine with sweat she couldn't afford to acknowledge. Not when Mr. Castellano at table 7 was watching her with the attention he usually reserved for counting money. Not when Mrs. DeLuca needed her wine refilled before the glass touched empty. Not when her entire month's rent depended on maintaining the illusion of effortless grace. She had perfected the art of invisibility that all career servers eventually mastered, present enough to anticipate needs before they were voiced, absent enough to protect the privacy of conversations that should never be repeated. Her lower back ached with the dull throb of a muscle pushed past its limit. Her calves burned like someone had replaced her bones with hot iron, and the professional smile she had worn like armor for 18 months at the gilded cage was beginning to feel like a mask made of broken glass. But Florence could not afford to slow down. Not tonight. Not when her mother's next round of chemotherapy was scheduled for Monday, and the insurance company had found another reason to delay payment. Not when her landlord's text messages had evolved from polite reminders to thinly veiled threats. Not when every dollar mattered and the men who dined at the gilded cage tipped in hundreds or not at all, depending on whether you had earned the privilege of their generosity. The main dining room moved with its usual Friday rhythm, a carefully choreographed dance of power and pretense. Business partners celebrated mergers that might be celebrated differently in courtrooms someday. Politicians laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, their wedding rings catching the light as they touched the hands of women who weren't their wives. Lawyers spoke in the coded language of men who knew exactly which laws they were dancing around. Florence glided through it all like smoke, a silver water pitcher balanced in one hand, her steps measured, her words precise, her expression attentive, but never curious. She had learned the first rule of survival in places like this. You saw nothing, you heard nothing, you remembered nothing that could make you dangerous to know. Perhaps that was why she noticed him the moment she returned from the kitchen. Table 12. Positioned in the alcove behind the hand-carved mahogany partition that separated the elite from the merely wealthy. The table reserved for men who paid extra not for better food but for shadows. James Robin. She had served him twice before in the past 6 weeks, always arriving at exactly 8:30, always with the same entourage of silent men in expensive suits whose jackets hung too heavy on one side, always ordering the bone-in ribeye and a Scotch neat, always leaving a tip of precisely 25%, never speaking loudly, never making demands, never acting like the kind of man who could end careers with a phone call. Yet every server understood that Table 12 required the precision of defusing a bomb, because when someone brought Mr. Robin the wrong scotch or interrupted him during a private conversation, they didn't get fired, they simply stopped appearing on the schedule. As if the universe itself had quietly edited them out of the gilded cage's story, without explanation or appeal. Florence had learned not to ask questions about men like James Robin. In a city where the most powerful families controlled everything from construction contracts to which restaurants survived health inspections, survival meant keeping your eyes lowered and your observations locked behind your teeth. She knew he was important in the way that mattered most, the kind of importance that never appeared in newspaper headlines but shaped the city's bones. Knew his silver beard was groomed with the same precision his empire was run. Knew the fresh scratch cutting across his cheekbone and the purple bruise shadowing his jaw spoke of violence that happened too recently to hide. Knew the tattoos crawling up from his collar and winding across his knuckles told stories written in ink and blood and broken bones. Tonight, something felt different. James Robin sat straighter than usual, his shoulders carrying tension like armor. His head of security, Kevin William, the man who usually stood 3 feet back with his hands clasped and his eyes scanning exits, leaned too close, whispering too urgently into his earpiece. Florence watched the scene from across the dining room, her instincts honed by years of reading the unspoken language of people in crisis. Kevin's hand moved to his jacket pocket twice in 30 seconds, a gesture that looked casual, but felt wrong. The other bodyguards, usually positioned like chess pieces protecting their king, stood too far away, as if invisible lines had been redrawn while no one was watching. Florence picked up the water pitcher and began her approach to table 12, her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She had learned to trust the feeling that crawled up her spine when something dangerous was unfolding in front of her, the same instinct that had kept her safe in a dozen bad situations before. As she drew closer, moving through the careful choreography of her profession, she caught fragments of Kevin's conversation, words that floated into the air like smoke and changed everything. Secured at the location. Confirmed. Both packages. When he leaves tonight. Florence's hand steadied the pitcher even as her mind raced. Packages. The word echoed in her skull with the weight of something terrible. She knew what it meant in this world of coded language and careful euphemisms. She knew who James Robin loved enough to be vulnerable. She knew what men did to other men's families when they wanted to send a message written in screams. She poured James Robin's water with hands that didn't shake, her face a perfect mask of professional indifference, even as her mind calculated the cost of what she was about to do. If she was wrong, she would lose everything. If she was right and stayed silent, a woman and a child would pay for someone else's war. Florence Martin had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible. Tonight, she would have to learn how to be seen. James Robin looked like a man carved from contradictions. His silver beard was trimmed with the precision of someone who understood that control began with appearance, each hair groomed into submission, catching the warm light of the chandelier and transforming it into something that looked almost noble. The fresh scratch cutting diagonally across his left cheek told a different story. The wound recent enough that the edges still held the angry red of violence, deep enough to have bled through his morning shave. A purple bruise bloomed along his jaw like a storm cloud, the kind that came from a fist connecting with bone. Yet he sat with the posture of a king in exile, his black suit tailored to perfection, the jacket unbuttoned just enough to reveal the collar of tattoos that crawled up his neck like ivy reclaiming a monument. The ink disappeared beneath his shirt, but Florence had seen enough during previous visits to know the artwork continued across his chest and down his arms, a biography written in symbols only certain people knew how to read. His gold watch caught her attention as he reached for his scotch, the kind of timepiece that cost more than most people earned in a year, heavy and deliberate on his wrist. The watch face was scratched, the band worn, as if he had owned it long enough for it to become part of his body rather than an accessory. His knuckles bore their own tattoos, letters and numbers that meant something to someone, and the scarring across his hands suggested they had broken bones that weren't his own. But it was his eyes that told Florence the most important truth. James Robin was exhausted. Not the surface fatigue of a long day, but the bone-deep weariness of a man carrying weight he could no longer distribute. He stared at the menu without reading it, his gaze unfocused, as if the act of choosing between ribeye and salmon required more energy than he possessed. His shoulders, despite their military straightness, held tension like a clenched fist that had forgotten how to open. He had come to the gilded cage for the same reason powerful men always sought out places like this, to eat one quiet meal in a room where the rules were clear and the threats were supposed to stay outside. Kevin William destroyed that illusion simply by existing too close. Florence had served James Robin twice before, and each time Kevin had maintained the perfect distance of a professional bodyguard, positioned near the exit with his hands clasped and his attention divided between the room and his principal. Tonight, Kevin hovered at James's shoulder like a shadow that had forgotten its place, leaning down to whisper something that made James's jaw tighten. Kevin's hand rested on the back of James's chair, with a familiarity that felt wrong, proprietary, as if the hierarchy between them had shifted when no one was looking. His other hand kept drifting to his jacket pocket in a gesture that tried to look casual but radiated nervous energy. The air around table 12 felt different tonight, charged with something Florence couldn't name but recognized in the way prey recognized the moment before the predator struck. Kevin smiled too much, spoke too quickly, moved with the manic energy of someone running on adrenaline and bad decisions. The other bodyguards had repositioned themselves, standing farther from James than protocol dictated, as if invisible strings had been cut and they were now orbiting a different center of gravity. James Robin sat in the eye of a storm he didn't know was forming, asking only for peace he would never receive. Florence approached table 12 with the water pitcher balanced in her left hand, her steps measured in the careful rhythm she had perfected over 18 months of navigating rooms where one misstep could cost everything. The crystal pitcher was heavy, condensation sliding down its sides and dampening her palm, but her grip remained steady even as her pulse hammered against her throat. She had learned to move through dining rooms like water flowing around stones, present but unremarkable, noticed only when absence would be inconvenient. Kevin Williams stood so close to James's chair that Florence had to angle her approach differently than usual, adjusting her path to accommodate the bodyguard's invasion of the carefully maintained space around the table. She murmured the practiced phrase that servers use to announce their presence without demanding attention, words that had become automatic after thousands of repetitions. James barely glanced up, his exhaustion making him indifferent to the small rituals of service. Kevin shifted his weight but didn't move away, forcing Florence to reach across his body to refill James's glass first, then the second glass positioned across the table where no one sat. That was when Kevin's hand rose to his ear, fingers brushing against the small communication device nestled there, and his voice dropped into the register men used when they believed themselves unheard. Florence had learned years ago that servers existed in a peculiar invisibility, present in the physical space but absent from the consciousness of those who believed power made them untouchable. People said things around servers they would never say around witnesses, as if black vests and bow ties rendered ears decorative rather than functional. Kevin's words slipped into the air between the clink of her pitcher against crystal and the distant murmur of conversation from nearby tables, each syllable landing in Florence's awareness like a stone dropping into still water. "The house is clear. We have the girls. He's next." The water continued to pour in a steady stream, because Florence's hands remembered their training, even as her mind fragmented into 1,000 directions at once. She finished filling the second glass with movements that looked exactly as they should, smooth and professional, betraying nothing of the electricity that had just surged through her nervous system. Kevin didn't look at her. James didn't look at her. She completed the ritual of service and stepped back from the table, turning toward the kitchen with the same unhurried pace she always used, as if the world had not just tilted on its axis. The kitchen doors swung closed behind her with their usual soft thump, and Florence's hands finally began to shake. The pitcher nearly slipped from her grip as she set it down on the stainless steel counter, the glass connecting with metal in a clatter that drew looks from the prep cooks working the line. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface, her breath coming too fast, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint, as her mind raced through the implications of what she had just heard. The girls. The house is clear. He's next. Florence had worked at the Gilded Cage long enough to understand the language of men like Kevin Williams, the coded phrases that turned violence into logistics, and human beings into packages to be secured or eliminated. She had seen James Robin twice before, had studied him with the observational skills all good servers developed, had noticed the details that told stories for those who knew how to read them. She knew he wore a wedding ring despite the rumors that said men in his position didn't advertise vulnerabilities. She knew he kept a small photograph, folded in his wallet, visible for just a moment when he paid the check. Two faces, looking back at the camera with smiles that seemed genuine. She knew the way his expression softened when he checked his phone during dessert, as if whatever message waited there was worth the breach of dining etiquette. The girls meant his family, his wife, his daughter, the people who made a man like James Robin into something more complicated than the violence written across his skin. And Kevin Williams, the man paid to protect him, had just confirmed their abduction with the casual efficiency of someone checking items off a list. Florence's mind calculated possibilities with the speed of desperation, each option weighing itself against consequences she couldn't afford to miscalculate. She could approach James directly, but Kevin stood 3 feet from his chair, close enough to hear any whispered warning, close enough to reach for whatever weapon rested beneath his jacket before she finished her first sentence. She could pull the fire alarm, evacuate the building, buy time through chaos, but that would alert Kevin that someone had heard, someone knew, and men like him eliminated problems with the efficiency of people who had practice. She could walk away, finish her shift, collect her tips, pretend the words had never reached her ears, let whatever was going to happen unfold without her fingerprints on the outcome. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken during Florence's childhood when moral choices seemed simpler and consequences felt theoretical. When you see something wrong and do nothing, you become part of the wrong. The philosophy had seemed noble when applied to playground bullies and neighborhood gossip. It felt significantly more dangerous when applied to men who disappeared people with a phone call. Florence's hands stopped shaking as the decision crystallized into action. She turned to the hostess stand near the kitchen entrance where the leather-bound menus waited in their brass holder, selecting one from the middle of the stack where its absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. The menu opened in her hands to reveal the dessert section, the thick cream-colored paper providing a canvas large enough for the message that would either save lives or end hers. The pen she pulled from her apron was the cheap kind that leaked slightly, the black ink bleeding into the paper fibers, as she wrote in letters large enough to be read quickly, clear enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. Her handwriting, usually careful and controlled, came out in sharp angles driven by urgency and fear. 8 words that contained everything Kevin's betrayal meant, everything James needed to know in the seconds before his last meal became exactly that. Your bodyguard sold you out, your family is the payment. Florence closed the menu and walked back into the dining room, carrying it like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Each step toward table 12 required active effort to maintain the pace of someone performing routine service, rather than committing an act that would reshape the trajectory of multiple lives. Kevin still hovered at James's shoulder, his attention divided between his phone screen and the dining room exits, confident in his control of a situation he believed was proceeding exactly as planned. James had leaned back in his chair, his scotch half finished, his expression settled into the neutral mask of someone waiting for food he had ordered more out of habit than hunger. Florence approached from James's left side, the angle that placed her body between him and Kevin's immediate line of sight. She kept her face arranged in the stern professionalism that servers wore when delivering information customers needed to hear, the expression that said, "This matters," without specifying why. Her voice emerged steady despite the adrenaline turning her blood into electricity, each word precisely enunciated in the tone she used for explaining complicated specials or warning about allergies. "Our specials tonight, sir." She placed the closed menu directly in front of James, her fingers releasing it with deliberate slowness. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a fraction of a second she saw his attention sharpen, recognizing something in her expression that didn't match the mundane nature of her stated purpose. She held his gaze and spoke the words that would either condemn or save them both. "Read carefully." Then she stepped back, her hands folded behind her spine where they could tremble without witness, and waited for James Robin to open the menu and discover that his quiet Friday dinner had just become a war. James Robin's fingers moved across the leather cover of the menu, with the unhurried grace of a man who had trained himself to never telegraph urgency, even when urgency might be the only thing keeping him alive. The tattooed knuckles flexed as he opened the cover, his gold watch catching the light in a brief flash before his attention dropped to the page Florence had prepared for him. She watched his eyes track across the handwritten words, each letter absorbing into his consciousness with the weight of bullets finding their targets. His expression didn't change. Not immediately, not in the ways most people revealed shock or fear or rage, but his fingers told a different story. The tattoos rippling across his knuckles and crawling up toward his wrists began to shift as the muscles beneath contracted, the ink distorting as his grip tightened on the paper. The cream-colored page began to wrinkle under the pressure, the edges curling inward as if trying to protect the words written across its surface. A vein appeared along his temple, pulsing once, twice, a metronome marking the passage of seconds, in which James Robin absorbed the intelligence that his most trusted protector had become his executioner. He looked up from the menu, and his eyes found Florence with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on reading people faster than they could read him. She had expected anger, the kind of volcanic fury that powerful men wore when their control slipped. She had braced herself for accusation, for the possibility that he would assume she was part of whatever conspiracy Kevin had orchestrated. Instead, she saw something far more dangerous staring back at her from across the white linen tablecloth. Calculation. Cold, merciless assessment that weighed her value against her risk in the span of a heartbeat. James Robin was looking at her the way a chess master looked at a board after discovering an opponent's strategy, already running through countermoves and contingencies, already deciding who would survive the next 60 seconds. Florence held his gaze and gave the smallest nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for the natural movement of breathing. She saw the acknowledgement register in his eyes, a fractional shift that said he understood she was offering him something rather than taking from him. Then his attention moved past her to where Kevin still hovered, and the mask of exhaustion James had worn all evening transformed into something that looked almost casual. "Kevin." His voice emerged with the texture of someone asking about weather rather than warfare, calm and conversational in a way that made the hair on Florence's arms stand straight. "Did Rodriguez call? About the house?" Kevin's response came too quickly, the words tumbling out with the eagerness of someone who had rehearsed his lies but hadn't accounted for the anxiety that made them sound hollow. "Yes, sir. Everything's secure. Your family's fine. Rodriguez checked in 20 minutes ago. All quiet on the home front." Florence watched James's face remain perfectly neutral, while something lethal crystallized behind his eyes. She had just witnessed a man confirm his own death sentence with enthusiasm, unaware that the trap had already closed around him. Kevin smiled as he delivered his fabricated assurance, the expression of someone who believed he was still holding all the cards, still controlling the narrative, still standing on the winning side of a coup he thought was proceeding flawlessly. James Robin closed the menu with deliberate care, his tattooed fingers smoothing the wrinkled paper one last time before setting it aside. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a king who had just decided which heads would roll before dawn. "Good. That's very good to hear." The violence happened faster than Florence's mind could process the individual components, each action blurring into the next, in a cascade that transformed the elegant dining room into something primal. James Robin's hand moved with the economy of someone who had ended conflicts before most people realized they had begun, reaching across the table to grip the steak knife resting beside his untouched plate. The blade caught the chandelier light for a fraction of a second, before James drove it downward with the full force of his weight behind it, the steel punching through Kevin Williams' right hand and continuing into the mahogany table beneath, with a sound like thunder cracking in a sealed room. Kevin's scream tore through the manufactured silence of the gilded cage, raw and animalistic, the sound of a man discovering that pain could arrive before comprehension. His left hand jerked toward the weapon, concealed beneath his jacket, instinct overriding the shock of betrayal discovered and reversed, but James was already moving. His other hand clamped around Kevin's wrist with fingers that had broken bones before, twisting the arm at an angle that forced Kevin's body to fold forward over the table or risk his shoulder dislocating from its socket. The dining room erupted into coordinated chaos that revealed how much of the evening had been theater and how much had been preparation. The bodyguards Florence had watched repositioning throughout the night suddenly moved with purpose, drawing weapons that had been concealed under expensive suits, converging on table 12 from multiple directions. But they weren't moving to protect Kevin. They were surrounding him, cutting off exits, weapons trained on the man who had been their superior 30 seconds ago and was now pinned to a table by his own treachery made visible. James's voice cut through the pandemonium with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed during crises, each word a bullet fired into the escalating disorder. "Castellano, take 3 men to my house. Now. Anyone you don't recognize dies on sight. Anyone who tries to leave with my family dies slowly." He yanked Kevin's head back by his hair, forcing eye contact while blood pooled around the knife still embedded in the table. "Where are they? Which cartel? How many men?" Kevin's response emerged in gasps between screams, words tumbling out in the desperate bargaining of someone who had just realized his coup had failed before it began. The information spilled across the table alongside the blood, locations, and numbers and names that James absorbed with the focused intensity of a general receiving battlefield intelligence. Florence stood frozen near the kitchen entrance, her body locked in place by the collision of what she had expected might happen and the visceral reality of watching it unfold. A hand gripped her upper arm with enough force to leave bruises, spinning her toward the emergency exit she had walked past 1,000 times without considering its purpose. The guard who held her was older than the others. His face, weathered by decades of violence, survived, and when he spoke, his voice carried the urgency of someone saving a life rather than ending one. "You didn't see anything. You weren't here. You vanish. Now." He shoved a folded stack of bills into her apron pocket, without counting, without ceremony, payment and warning delivered in the same gesture. The metal door opened onto the alley, where garbage from a dozen restaurants created a landscape of rot and survival, the cold air hitting Florence's face like a slap designed to wake the dead. She ran into the November darkness, while behind her, the gilded cage began the careful work of erasing the last 30 minutes from existence. And Florence Martin ceased being a witness to become something far more dangerous, someone who had changed the outcome. The television in Florence's studio apartment flickered with the blue light of late-night news broadcasts. The volume turned low enough that her neighbors wouldn't complain, but loud enough that she could hear the anchor's voice narrating the city's violence with the detached professionalism of someone who had reported 100 similar stories. Florence sat on the edge of her second-hand couch with her knees pulled to her chest, still wearing the clothes she had run home in 3 hours earlier, her server's uniform stained with sweat and fear that hadn't finished wringing itself from her system. The breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen in letters designed to demand attention. Shootout at estate in prestigious neighborhood. Multiple casualties, family members safe. The footage showed police lights painting a mansion's facade in alternating red and blue. Yellow crime scene tape cordoning off a property that probably cost more than Florence would earn in 10 lifetimes. The reporter spoke about an apparent home invasion thwarted by private security, about suspects fleeing the scene, about the homeowner and his family escaping without injury thanks to what authorities were calling exceptional response time. They didn't mention James Robin by name. Men like him had lawyers and connections that kept their identities out of official narratives, transforming newsworthy violence into generic incidents that could be forgotten by the next news cycle. But Florence knew. She recognized the architecture visible behind the police perimeter, the iron gates she had seen in background photographs that James occasionally checked on his phone. His wife and daughter were safe. The men Kevin William had sent to collect payment for his betrayal had failed. The second story arrived on Sunday morning, buried on page 7 of the newspaper Florence bought from the corner store because she couldn't trust herself to stop refreshing news websites. A body discovered in the river, male. Preliminary identification suggested the deceased was a security professional with ties to various business interests in the city. The article was short, clinical, offering no details about how the man had ended up in the water, or why someone had taken the time to weight his body with chains that had almost been sufficient to keep him submerged. Kevin William had been erased from the narrative as efficiently as he had tried to erase James Robin. Florence existed in a state of suspended terror for 3 days, waiting for consequences she couldn't predict but felt certain would arrive. She called in sick to the gilded cage, her voice hoarse from sleepless nights, and spent her hours watching the door to her apartment, as if violence could be deterred by vigilance alone. She jumped at footsteps in the hallway. She analyzed every car that parked on her street, memorizing colors and license plates, searching for patterns that might indicate surveillance. She kept her phone charged and her shoes by the door, maintaining the illusion that she could run if running became necessary. On the 4th day, she forced herself back to work because rent was due, and fear couldn't pay bills. The morning shift at the gilded cage passed in a blur of routine service, the dining room blissfully empty of dangerous men making dangerous decisions. She was clearing table 8 when Miguel, the host, appeared at her elbow with the expression of someone delivering news he didn't want to carry. "There's a car outside, for you." Florence's hands froze on the water glasses she had been stacking, the crystal suddenly feeling too heavy to hold. She followed Miguel to the front windows, where the November afternoon light revealed a black SUV idling at the curb, the kind of vehicle that cost more than her annual salary and announced its purpose through deliberate intimidation. The windows were tinted dark enough to hide whoever waited inside, but Florence already knew. She had been waiting for this moment since she had written 8 words on a dessert menu and handed them to a man who controlled more of the city than the mayor's office. The rear door of the SUV opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. His posture relaxed, but alert in the way of people trained to identify threats before they materialized. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply gestured toward the open door, with the patience of someone who had been given specific instructions about how this conversation would proceed. Florence untied her apron with hands that had stopped shaking somewhere between terror and resignation, and walked toward the car that would either end her story or rewrite it entirely. The Robin estate existed behind walls that made promises about privacy and delivered threats about trespassing, the kind of property that announced wealth through understatement rather than ostentation. The SUV passed through iron gates that opened without human intervention, rolling up a driveway lined with trees that had been planted before Florence was born. The mansion at the end of the drive was beautiful in the way that power often was, all clean lines and expensive taste, wrapped around the brutal reality of how such beauty was purchased and maintained. The escort led Florence through side entrances that servants and security used, corridors decorated with art that probably belonged in museums, until they reached a sunroom at the back of the house, where afternoon light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows. That was where she found James Robin, and the scene before her required a fundamental recalibration of everything she thought she understood about dangerous men. He sat cross-legged on the carpet with a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7, her dark hair pulled into pigtails that had started the day neat but had surrendered to the chaos of childhood. They were building something elaborate with blocks, a castle or fortress that sprawled across the floor in ambitious architecture that defied gravity through determination alone. James's jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the full roadmap of tattoos that covered his forearms. and his expression held the kind of focused attention most people reserved for matters of life and death. The girl was explaining her vision for the tower they were constructing, her voice animated with the certainty of someone who had never been told her ideas weren't worth hearing, and James listened as if she were briefing him on military strategy, rather than explaining why the princess needed a dragon instead of a knight. He looked up when Florence entered, and she saw something flicker across his face that might have been relief, or gratitude, or the complicated emotion of a man who had come within minutes of losing everything that mattered. The girl noticed the shift in her father's attention, and turned to study Florence with the frank curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to hide their assessments behind politeness. "Emma, sweetheart." James's voice carried the gentle authority of a father who rarely needed to raise it. "Go find your mother. Tell her our guest is here." The girl gathered an armful of blocks with the efficiency of someone following a familiar protocol, kissed her father's cheek with casual affection, and departed the room with a backward glance at Florence that contained more evaluation than most adults managed in entire conversations. The door closed with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. James Robin stood with the careful movement of someone whose body carried damage it had learned to accommodate, and when he spoke, his voice held none of the cold calculation Florence had witnessed at the gilded cage. Instead, she heard exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "I built an empire by trusting the wrong thing." He gestured toward the windows that overlooked grounds where his daughter could play without fear, because armed men patrolled the perimeter. "I trusted loyalty. I trusted history. I trusted men who had bled beside me and proven themselves in 100 situations that should have meant something." His tattooed fingers flexed, the same gesture she had seen when he read her warning. "Kevin Williams saved my life twice. I stood at his daughter's wedding. I trusted him with everything that mattered because I believed loyalty was the currency that couldn't be counterfeited." James turned to face Florence directly, and she understood why men feared him. Not because of the violence written across his skin, or the reputation that preceded him into rooms, but because of the intelligence that burned behind his eyes, the capacity to see patterns others missed, and act on them before hesitation became fatal. "You saw what a trained killer hid. You heard what I was supposed to miss. You risked everything to warn a stranger because it was the right thing to do, and that kind of instinct can't be taught." He moved closer, not threatening but deliberate. "I need eyes that see what mine can't. I need someone who exists in spaces where people forget to guard their words. I need what you have, and I'm prepared to pay for it." Florence's voice emerged steadier than she expected. "What exactly are you offering?" "Everything you need to never be invisible again unless you choose to be." The training began the next morning in a basement that didn't appear on any floor plan of the Robin estate, a room insulated against sound and curiosity, where Florence learned that intelligence gathering was a language with its own grammar and dialects. Her instructors were men and women who had spent careers in the shadows, former military intelligence officers and retired federal agents who had discovered that loyalty to a country paid significantly less than loyalty to families like the Robins. They taught her to read lips across crowded rooms, to recognize the micro-expressions that preceded lies, to memorize the hierarchy of rival organizations through the tattoos and jewelry their members wore like resumes, written in symbols only initiates could decode. The shooting lessons surprised her least, though her instructor, a woman named Carmen, who had spent 20 years in personal security, approached firearms with the clinical detachment of someone teaching a necessary but unremarkable skill. Florence learned the mechanics of weapons she hoped never to use, the weight of metal that could end lives with pressure measured in pounds, the responsibility that came with carrying tools designed exclusively for destroying human bodies. She was adequate but not exceptional. Her hands steady enough to pass qualification but lacking the muscle memory that came from years of practice. The counter-surveillance training consumed her evenings, endless exercises in spotting tails and detecting electronic monitoring, in understanding how people became targets before they realized they were being watched. She learned to identify the makes and models of vehicles commonly used for surveillance, to recognize the behavioral patterns of people conducting reconnaissance, to trust the instinct that had saved James Robin's family when it whispered warnings her rational mind wanted to dismiss. But the most valuable lessons came from Marcus, a man in his 60s whose gentle demeanor disguised decades of work infiltrating organizations that ate informants alive. He taught Florence the cartography of the underworld, the families and cartels and syndicates that controlled different territories and industries, the alliances that shifted like weather patterns and the blood feuds that remained constant across generations. She memorized faces from surveillance photographs, learned to identify made men by the rings they wore and the saints they prayed to, studied the visual language of tattoos that announced affiliations and achievements, and crimes worn as badges of honor. The tattoo lessons haunted her. Marcus would project images on the wall of their classroom, while Florence took notes that felt like cataloging demons, each symbol representing violence she was learning to anticipate rather than prevent. A teardrop under the eye meant a murder completed or a friend lost to prison. A crown with 5 points announced membership in a specific cartel. A spiderweb on the elbow signified time served in institutions where survival required becoming someone harder than the person who entered. She learned to read bodies the way scholars read texts, understanding that skin was just another surface, where men wrote their histories in ink and pain. The morality of her new life arrived in waves that threatened to drown her during moments when the training paused and reality reasserted itself. She was learning to serve an organization built on violence and extortion, learning to protect a man whose wealth derived from industries that destroyed families and communities. She lay awake in the guest room James had provided, staring at ceiling molding that cost more than her mother's medical bills, wondering when exactly she had crossed the line between witness and accomplice. But then she would remember Emma Robin, 7 years old with pigtails and opinions about dragon architecture, alive because Florence had chosen intervention over invisibility. She would remember James's wife, a woman whose face Florence had only seen in photographs, safe because a server had risked everything to scribble 8 words on a menu. The innocence she had saved became the justification for everything else, the moral arithmetic that allowed her to continue learning how to navigate a world where right and wrong existed in shades too complicated for simple judgment. 3 months into her training, Marcus showed her a photograph of a rival family's lieutenant, a man whose tattoos told stories of violence spanning 2 decades. Florence identified his affiliations, recited his history, predicted his likely response patterns to various scenarios, and felt the weight of knowledge that could be used to destroy him settling into her consciousness like sediment at the bottom of dark water. She was becoming exactly what James Robin needed. The question she couldn't answer was whether she recognized the person she was becoming. The peace summit took place in neutral territory, a private dining room at the Continental Hotel, where men who had spent months trying to kill each other could break bread under the pretense that business was never personal. 6 months had passed since Kevin Williams' body was pulled from the river. 6 months of careful negotiations and back-channel communications that had finally produced this meeting between James Robin and Victor Castellano, the cartel lieutenant whose ambition had orchestrated the failed coup. The room was arranged with the precision of a diplomatic summit, 2 tables positioned close enough for conversation but far enough apart to provide psychological distance, each principal surrounded by advisors and security, whose weapons remained holstered but ready. Florence stood behind James and to his left, occupying the position she had earned through months of training and the trust she had purchased with a warning written on a dessert menu. She wore a tailored black suit that disguised the fact that she was armed, her hair pulled back in a severe style that made her face unreadable, her expression locked in the neutral professionalism that had once been the mask of a server and had become the face of an intelligence operative. She no longer poured water or carried trays. She read rooms and identified threats and whispered warnings that kept her principal alive. The negotiations proceeded with the careful formality of men who understood that peace was just war conducted through different vocabulary. Victor Castellano spoke about mutual interests and shared territories, about the inefficiency of conflict and the profit margins that cooperation could deliver. James responded with measured agreement, his words diplomatic even as his eyes remained calculating, searching for the trap he knew existed somewhere in the architecture of this arrangement. Florence listened while appearing not to listen, her attention divided between the spoken conversation and the visual intelligence that played out in gestures and glances, and the small behaviors that revealed what words tried to hide. That was when she noticed the woman seated 3 chairs to Victor's right, introduced earlier as his wife Sophia, but occupying space with the stillness of someone trained in violence rather than socialized in luxury. Sophia Castellano wore an elegant dress in deep emerald, her jewelry expensive but understated, her posture perfect in the way that came from either finishing school or military discipline. Most people would have seen only what Sophia wanted them to see, a beautiful woman enduring a boring business discussion, with the patience wives of powerful men learn to cultivate. But Florence had spent 3 months memorizing the tells that preceded violence, the micro-movements that betrayed concealed weapons and hostile intent. Sophia's left hand rested on her lap with fingers positioned in a way that suggested proximity to something that didn't belong. The drape of her dress was almost perfect, but not quite perfect enough to hide the slight asymmetry near her right hip where fabric hung differently than gravity alone would dictate. When Sophia shifted her weight, Florence caught the outline of something angular and metallic pressing against silk. The realization arrived with the clarity of pattern recognition, pieces connecting with the speed of instinct refined through training. This peace summit was another trap. Victor Castellano had come to negotiate the terms of James Robin's execution, using diplomacy as the distraction while his wife positioned herself to complete what Kevin William had started. The weapon was small caliber, probably ceramic to bypass the metal detectors everyone had passed through before entering the neutral ground. Sophia would wait until the signing of whatever agreement had been crafted to lure James into false security, then fire at close range while guards were still processing the breach of protocol. Florence moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in scenarios that prepared for exactly this contingency. She didn't shout a warning or draw her weapon, or create the kind of obvious alarm that would accelerate whatever timeline Sophia was working against. Instead, she leaned forward as if adjusting James's water glass, her mouth close enough to his ear that her whisper would reach him alone, her voice barely audible above the ambient conversation filling the room. Castellano's wife, right hip, ceramic piece, wait for my signal. James Robin didn't react visibly, didn't turn to look at Sophia or give any indication that the equation of the room had just changed. He continued his response to Victor's latest proposal, his tone unchanged, his body language relaxed, buying time while Florence's warning rewrote the strategy playing out beneath the surface of diplomacy. She watched his hand move to rest on the table, fingers positioned where his own security could see them, a silent code that rippled through his team with the efficiency of a language outsiders couldn't speak. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, seconds, feeling like hours as Florence calculated angles and response times and the dozen ways this situation could detonate into violence that would leave bodies scattered across white tablecloths. Then James's fingers shifted into a different configuration, and his men moved with choreographed precision, surrounding the Castellano contingent before anyone could process what was happening. Sophia's hand jerked toward her hip, instinct overriding tactics, but James's head of security, a man named Torres, who had replaced Kevin William with the efficiency of succession in violent organizations, already had his weapon drawn and trained on her center mass. The room froze in the tableau of betrayal discovered, Victor Castellano's face transforming from diplomatic charm to the cold fury of a plan unraveled. Sophia's eyes meeting Florence's across the space between them with recognition that said one operative to another. "You saw me." James Robin stood slowly, his hands visible and empty, his voice carrying the weight of judgment already rendered. "I came here for peace, Victor. You came here for war dressed in peace's clothing." He gestured toward Sophia without looking at her directly. "Remove the weapon, carefully." The aftermath unfolded with the grim efficiency of protocols everyone in the room understood. Security disarming Sophia, while lawyers and advisors began the damage control that would transform this attempted assassination into a diplomatic incident that both sides would pretend never happened. Florence remained in position, her weapon still holstered, because the threat had been neutralized before it could evolve into action. Her heart rate elevated, but her hands steady. James Robin turned to look at her across the room, where peace had nearly become a funeral, and in his eyes Florence saw recognition that went beyond gratitude or professional approval. She had proven herself in the way that mattered most in his world. She had seen the invisible threat and acted before it could become inevitable tragedy. She was no longer the server who had stumbled into saving his family through accident of proximity. She was the guardian he had trained her to become, the eyes that saw what trained killers hid, the shield that stood between him and the betrayals that arrived wearing friendly faces. They shared that look for 3 seconds that rewrote the terms of their relationship, a partnership forged not in contracts or promises, but in the shared understanding of people who had survived violence together and would do so again. Florence Martin had walked into the gilded cage 6 months ago as someone invisible, struggling to pay rent and keep her mother alive, believing her greatest skill was the ability to disappear into the background of other people's lives. She had become something else entirely, the keeper of secrets, the guardian of the Robin legacy, the woman who saw everything and forgot nothing, who moved through shadows by choice rather than necessity, who had learned that survival sometimes required becoming dangerous enough that danger thought twice before approaching. James nodded once. Acknowledgement and dismissal and confirmation all contained in a single gesture, then turned back to Victor Castellano to deliver whatever consequences betrayal earned in the economy of men who controlled the city's bones. Florence remained standing, her position earned and her purpose clear. no longer wondering who she had become but accepting what necessity had required her to transform into. She was Florence Martin, and she saw everything.